Hey y'all, here we are with a theology of love. I suspect most, if not all of us, have read this book at least once, if not multiple times. But she happens to be a favorite of mine and is definitely a cornerstone for my dissertation. This book is considered her magnum opus. She is the one that makes contemporary Wesleyan theology possible. She is definitely a hinge figure between the earlier sort of, well, basically we all know the history that we'd gotten very, very legalistic in our tradition, and she sets out to correct that. She resets the terms of what holiness is, what it means. So her context, again, these are things that we know, but it's important for us to know and go over again. So she was a pastor and theologian in the Church of the Nazarene. She was not primarily an academic, so her writing is tinged more with the that sense of pastoral urgency. The holiness movement, as she lived in it as a child and to her adulthood, had entered into what she calls crisis magic, the idea that holiness was a substance that you received in a single dramatic moment, and if you didn't feel it, something was wrong with you. The result was a lot of guilt, despair, anti-intellectualism, and a kind of moralistic harshness that drove people away from the very holiness that they were seeking. She calls this the credibility gap, which is that disconnect between what holiness doctrine promises and what people were actually experiencing. She lays the blame squarely on the tradition embracing the wrong philosophical categories, which just, philosophy is bad. Basically, we had borrowed Greek substantive metaphysics instead of staying within biblical relational categories. And Winecoop's goal was both simple and enormous: to make holiness livable, relational, and experiential again. And one of the quotes down here that you see at the bottom that I just love, again, love takes the harshness out of holiness. Love takes the incredibility out of perfection. Love takes the moralism out of obedience. So she is centering holy love. Her core argument: holiness is fundamentally relational, not substantive or transactional. Everything else she writes flows from this central claim. Sin is not a substance lodged in our nature for Winecoop, and therefore holiness is also not a substance that is then infused into us. Both sin and holiness are orientations of love. Sin is agape curved inwards, love directed, or rather misdirected, toward the self. Holiness is agape rightly centered, oriented toward and around Christ. What changes in sanctification is not our metaphysical makeup, but our relational orientation, where our love is pointed first toward Christ and then toward others. And this quote that we see at the top, she writes that holiness is wholeness and health, and everything God requires is in the interest of that wholesomeness, which is it's just a really accessible way of talking about holiness. We understand these terms, wholeness and health. And she's replacing crisis language here. She's making sure to be clear that, again, this isn't metaphysics, this isn't dramatic rupture, it's the restoration of the self to a right orientation toward God and others. She does a lot of key moves, several key moves in this book, because again, she is essentially resetting the whole holiness tradition. First, she diagnoses the credibility gap. When the holiness movement uses Greek substantive categories, again, sin is a substance to be eradicated, grace is a substance to be infused. This then creates these crisis magic expectations. When people's experience don't match this, when they don't have this feeling of holiness per se, the doctrine is not questioned. The people are questioned. So it's really interesting to me the way that she opens up this conversation about feelings. She doesn't deny that feelings matter. She is reorienting us toward what a feeling of love is supposed to motivate us toward. In her second move, she gives us her axial distinction, this substantive versus relational. And this is the hinge or the center point on which her entire theology turns. When substantive frameworks treat sin and grace as things, and relational frameworks treat them as orientations. She argues the Bible is fundamentally relational, and the tradition drifts when it adopts substantive categories from Greek philosophy. And her third move is a relational anthropology. She insists that humans are one acting self. We're not divided. There's no spiritual layer separate from the psychological. This matters because it's what makes sanctification a genuinely moral and personal category rather than a metaphysical operation performed on a sub-rational layer of the self. And so this is a sequence that builds. It's a diagnosis. Oh, sorry, my dogs are distracting me. It's naming the problem, a diagnosis, and then establishing an alternative framework. She then goes on to make 3 additional moves. In her treatment of the Imago Dei, she distinguishes image from likeness. Image is relational standing, or our capacity for relationship with God, and that is never lost. Likeness is the teleological goal, which is Christ-likeness. Her formulation for this is the apparatus is intact, but the light is out. The faculties remain, and the orientation is misdirected. So that distinguishes our tradition from more reformed Calvinists. Like, we don't need the image of God restored. What we need is our ability to move toward Christ-likeness restored. And then she lists or discusses agape as orientation. This is not an infused substance. It's an inherent human capacity directed toward an object. Sin is agape directed toward the self. Holiness is agape directed toward Christ. Sanctification is the reorientation of this capacity, not its replacement. And her final move ties sanctification and ecclesiology together. Entire sanctification means whole person integration in Christ. It is teleological and ongoing, not a terminal state you arrive at once. And holiness is also socially mediated. It's impossible to become holy apart from community, which connects us to some of our ecclesiology reading from that list. And her summary here on page 51 is that holiness is moral to the core, love to God and humans, she writes man, qualities of the self in relation to the person of God and fellow humans. So you can see some key terms here. I think the one that is probably the most interesting to me is this substantive versus relational framing. Obviously, you know, I joke that philosophy is bad, but it is interesting to see the ways that we can maybe uncritically adopt philosophical assumptions that don't actually fit within our theological framework. So I find that just very interesting. And these are definitely the main sort of vocabulary that we need to know for Wynkoop. There is some debate about her work. So Olson names what he terms the Finney problem. Wynkoop's emphasis on human choice and human orientation, it risks collapsing grace into moral enabling, as if sanctification is something you can achieve by your own choice rather than something that grace works in you. And Olson just wants to make sure that we're not sliding into Pelagianism here, that we're carefully foregrounding grace. And Wynkoop does do that. Olson is just naming a risk here. And then Noble and Dunning, they don't question her Wesleyan fidelity or the fact that our tradition needed a corrective. They are simply pointing out she's not an expositor. She's a constructive theologian, so she is building something as she reads Wesley. And then Dayton and Daniels remind us that her work it's like dynamite. We are still dealing with the fallout, and I think we see this in our churches, we see this in the denomination as a whole, in things like the Holiness Partnership, as they attack our seminary and our universities. We're still basically, we still haven't heard Wynkoop fully. We're still struggling to embrace what she has said. And her conversation placement, where she sits in this whole conversation. The holiness movement works with Christ's magic model built on substantive categories. Wynkoop breaks that open with relational ontology and agape as orientation. Maddox then takes her framework and extends it into what he terms therapeutic anthropology, or responsible grace. Wynkoop gives Maddox the relational ontology he needs. Without her, there is no framework for Maddox, Collins, or Noble. She is what makes contemporary Wesleyan constructive theology possible. She is the hinge figure. And we can see another important quote from her here, that love is the essential inner character of holiness, and holiness does not exist apart from love. This is her entire constructive project. She is not saying love is an attribute of holiness or that love accompanies holiness. She is saying love is the character of holiness. Holiness cannot exist without it. And this is what makes her so different from the crisis perfectionist model that she's correcting. The tradition that she critiques as it was, and as we still struggle with today, defines holiness by what is absent. An absent of pride or of self-will or of anger or of beer in your refrigerator. Wynkoop is defining holiness by what is present, which is love. So again, why this matters, it's because Wynkoop is the hinge. She's the person between crisis holiness and contemporary Wesleyan conversation. Knowing her is knowing why the tradition looks the way it does today. She gives the relational and existential framework that Maddox refines. We cannot understand Maddox's therapeutic anthropology without Wynkoop's relational ontology underneath it. She recovers the tradition's own resources. Like, she's not looking to the outside to construct her project. She's arguing that Wesley is already working relationally, and the movement lost that emphasis when it adopted Greek substantive categories. And finally, her agape as orientation opens the ground for contemporary Wesleyan constructive theology. She makes room for what comes after her. To put all of this together, Wynkoop argues that holiness is not a substance received in a crisis, but a whole person orientation of agape toward Christ, exposing the credibility gap, recovering relational anthropology, and redefining entire sanctification as teleological integration, thereby hinging the tradition from perfectionism to transformation. As she writes, perfection is not principally the absence of all that is less than perfect, but the presence of love with all the dynamic meaning of love. So holiness is not defined by what is absent. It is defined by what is present. Love directed rightly toward Christ, which integrates us into the whole kind of people that God always intended us to be. That is Mildred Bang's Wynkoop. She is awesome, and I hope this was helpful for y'all.